Welcome back to the Project Return online classroom. I'm Miss Celia, and today I wanted to take the time to make another poetry video and give you guys some tips and tricks that you can do to spice up your poetry and make it a little bit more interesting. I'm sure you've read the title already, but today we're going to be talking about symbolism in poetry and what it can do for you. As we know, we read a lot of poems, right? Poetry is very unique to the individual and to the author, and it can also be interpreted many different ways based on our own unique experiences. Authors oftentimes leave their work up to interpretation for this reason, because it forms a genuine connection between the reader and the work. They may be intentionally vague at times, say something that means another, or use symbolism. Symbolism, or a symbol, is the use of an object, drawing, or character to represent something that is implied but not directly stated. So typically it's a noun, a person, place, or thing that means something or is referring to a quality of that thing without directly being stated. Symbols usually make you feel something. It oftentimes can match the tone of the poem, and the tone is how the poem makes you feel. When you finish reading it, are you sad? Are you happy? Are you hopeful for the future? That kind of thing, those emotions that you feel create tone. So symbols are used to evoke emotion and create that tone. They can also convey a hidden meaning to the reader and add depth to a poem while conveying those emotions. So on the surface, a poem may mean one thing, but the true meaning, if you analyze those symbols and dig a little deeper, is something completely different that we didn't even see. A good way of understanding symbolism is to think about the symbols that are around us every day. Things like the cross, which will represent Christianity and Catholicism, that's a symbol. Using a plus sign in math will always mean you're adding, while using a minus sign will always mean you're subtracting. So those are symbols that have a meaning to them. Or things like red light means stop, green light means go. So a red light doesn't say stop, but everybody knows that when you see a red light, you stop. So things that are common and not necessarily unique to the individual, but everybody understands, we refer to as universal symbolism. And these are symbols that no matter what the context is, people will understand what you mean and what you're saying. And these symbols have oftentimes been used across cultures throughout history, so they have a very lengthy history behind them, and that's why everybody kind of knows what they mean. For example, birds are oftentimes a symbol of freedom. So when you have Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," if birds typically represent freedom, her symbolism of a caged bird, a restricted bird who's no longer free, means that her freedom is taken from her. She feels caged just like the bird does. Another example of a universal symbol is darkness. Darkness, black, nighttime, being a symbol of evil or death. Flowers can be a symbol of new life and hope and happiness. And the sun can be a symbol of guidance or brightness and warmth. While we have universal symbolism, we also have something that are called dichotomous symbols. And a lot of times we may run into symbols that have an opposite. So the same way that I mentioned darkness and nighttime representing evil or death, we also have daytime, which represents light and happiness and truth. So light representing goodness, dark representing evil. Some other examples of dichotomous symbols include sunrise and sunset. While sunrise may suggest a new beginning, sunset, where the sun is going down, may suggest the ending of an era. Or being awake versus being asleep. Being awake, you're aware, you're understanding, you have a knowledge of what's going on, whereas being asleep is oftentimes a symbol for ignorance to a thing, or unknowing, or ununderstanding, not understanding. Dichotomous symbols, opposite symbols, can serve a few different functions. They can provide contrast between two things and give us a better understanding of each by talking about their differences. And they can also describe two options and the author's inability to choose between them. So if you have an instance where an author is commonly mentioning light versus commonly mentioning dark and describing those two things, but seemingly going back and forth, we can kind of infer that there is a good decision versus a bad decision that the author needs to make that is writing about, that he can't seem to choose between because he's starkly comparing the two. So it can serve a few functions. I now want to take the opportunity to go over some symbols in action. I have picked out a few short poems that I think are great examples using symbolism, and I hope this gives you a better idea of how symbols can be used and what kind of depth they can add to a poem.
So the first symbol in action comes from an excerpt from The Rain by William H. Davis, and it reads, "I hear leaves drinking rain, I hear rich leaves on top, giving the poor beneath drop after drop. 'Tis a sweet noise to hear, these green leaves drinking near." When we first look at it, we think it's a nice, beautiful poem about foliage or leaves or bushes or something like that. But when we dig a little deeper, we can start to pick out that there are some symbols in here. For example, in the second and third line, he mentions rich versus poor. And then he also mentions top versus beneath. So these are dichotomous in that you have the top, which is the rich, and the poor, which is beneath the rich. So when we look at it a little bit closer, we can kind of think maybe there's ties to class discrepancy, rich individuals versus poor individuals. I hear leaves drinking rain, drop after drop, and then he later describes the leaves as green leaves drinking near. Green, oftentimes a symbol for money and envy. So essentially, William Davis is comparing rich to the poor, saying that the rich leaves, the rich people on top, drink all the rain, drink the money, and drink the power, and then give small drops of it to the poor individuals beneath them. Rain is a symbol in this context for money or power, and leaves are a symbol for people and class in America. The next symbol in action I want to discuss is an excerpt from Daffodils by William Wordsworth, and it reads, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze." Now, the first and the fourth line are probably the most important lines in this, because in the first line, he describes himself lonely as a cloud. So using lonely as a cloud is an example of a simile, because he's comparing himself to a cloud directly, as him and a cloud are both lonely. Now later on he writes, "When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." A crowd and a host mean that there are a lot of things together. He sees a crowd of daffodils, he sees a whole valley of them. So we have the comparison in the first line of him being as lonely as a cloud versus looking down on all of the daffodils dancing in the wind together and fluttering in the breeze. That comparison of lonely versus looking out, looking on the inside from the out, kind of represents that the author feels like an outsider. He feels like a cloud that's looking down on everybody around him, and he does not feel a part of those around him. So in this sense, the symbol is cloud, and then the crowd of golden daffodils. He may not directly be speaking about a crowd of daffodils. He's probably more referring to the crowds of people that he sees around him that he does not see himself fitting in with. The final symbol in action that I want to talk about today is an excerpt from As You Like It by the one and only William Shakespeare, and it reads, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." Something that we need to know in order to analyze this accurately is that during the time of William Shakespeare, players referred to actors. So he's using a lot of symbols of the theater, right? A stage, players being actors, exits and entrances, and playing many parts. So in this excerpt, William Shakespeare is comparing men and women to actors. And later on in the final line, he says, one man in his time plays many parts. So in that final line, a man playing many parts, you might say that if one individual can play many roles in their life. For example, they may be a father, they may be a construction worker, they may do this and do that. One individual can do a lot of different things. Men and women are players, they're actors on the world stage. So basically, everything to William Shakespeare in this excerpt feels very choreographed. People playing their parts and their roles, and people seemed very staged. You kind of have to, while analyzing symbols very closely, have to also keep in mind on what the broader picture of the work says. Because if you look at just the first line, all the world's a stage, that doesn't give us and doesn't match up with the tone of the rest of the excerpt. So you have to be able to piece together symbols and see what they mean as a whole, as well as on their own independently.
Using symbols seems a lot easier said than done. It can be very hard to integrate symbols into your writing when you sit down and you want to have that depth and really make the reader feel something without explicitly telling them to feel it. So I have a few steps that you can use to use symbols, integrate them into your writing that may help you. My first step that I recommend is develop your tone. Think about what you're trying to say. Think about the message you want to send and how you want the reader to feel. Do you want them to feel hopeful or sad or dreadful or scared after they finish reading your work? Pick a tone that you really think fits the message of your poem. Once you have your tone, select your symbols. If we want our symbols to match the tone of our writing, because we wouldn't want to focus on something that doesn't make sense in our work. So if we're writing a sad poem about wandering and feeling lost and confused, we would not necessarily use the symbol of the sun because that provides a completely contrasting message to what we're trying to send. So if we are using a tone of new beginnings, we want to feel hopeful, optimistic. We may pick symbols for new beginnings, which can include sunrise, springtime, flowers, babies, seeds, butterflies, or the phoenix, which are all symbols of new beginnings, overcoming, and hope. So we want to pick symbols that match the tone that we're going for. And then finally, placing symbols in your poem. This can be the trickiest part, but now that we have selected our tone and we have a list of possible symbols that we can use in our work, pour your heart out. Start writing. Write about how you feel. Pick a subject that relates to the tone that you are trying to convey and just go for it. When you're using a symbol, decide if you want to make a direct or indirect comparison. We've talked a little bit about this when we discussed literary devices in a previous video. A direct comparison uses a literary device that's called a simile. And a simile uses the words like, as if, or as though. They compare two things directly by stating both things. For example, life is like a box of chocolates. Life is like a box of chocolates. So we're comparing life to a box of chocolates directly by saying they are like each other for whatever reason. And then we can also use an indirect comparison, which uses a literary device that's referred to as a metaphor, which does not use any of those key words that I mentioned before. So it does not use the words like, as if, or as though. It just indirectly states that these two things are the same thing. For example, she is a snake in my boot. When you hear snake in my boot, you think a nuisance, you don't want it to be there. So saying that she is a snake in your boot, you're saying that she's an inconvenience, she's a nuisance to you, and you don't want her to be there. So you can see life is like a box of chocolates, saying that two things are similar, versus she is a snake in my boot. These two things are the same because they have a common characteristic. Incorporating symbols into your work takes a lot of practice, and it is something that will get easier the more that you write, but I encourage you guys to practice using symbolism, as it can add a fantastic amount of depth and knowledge and really evoke tone and emotion, which is really what authors want out of our writing, right? We want our readers to get something out of our writing, otherwise why would we be writing? Thank you guys so much for watching my video on symbolism. I hope I was able to give you a little bit of guidance about a cool, fresh element that you can put in your writing. I'd love to see your poems that you can influence and input symbols in, and I will see you guys in the next video. Have a fantastic day. Bye!